4 astronauts floated behind the far side of the moon on April 6, 2026, and the sun disappeared completely from their window. No camera bolted to the spacecraft was aimed at what happened in the next 53 minutes. No mission plan written over the past decade listed this moment as a goal. No human being had ever stood in that exact spot in space to watch it happen, and for the first time since 1972, there were people out there at all who even could. This was not a planned observation. It was not a checklist item. It was something 4 astronauts stumbled onto by accident on a spacecraft that was never supposed to be idle long enough for anyone to notice. What their cameras picked up during those minutes, and what almost kept them from getting home safely just days earlier, is a story most news coverage barely scratched. Stay with this one, because the full picture is stranger than the headlines suggested. To understand why an unplanned darkness became one of the most talked about moments of the mission, you need to know what Artemis II actually was. Apollo 17 came home in December of 1972, and for the following 54 years, every human spaceflight stayed close to Earth. The Space Shuttle, the International Space Station, every crew for over half a century, none of them ever left low orbit. Artemis II was built to end that streak. NASA launched it on April 1, 2026, in the evening, lifting off from Kennedy Space Center on the Space Launch System, the most powerful rocket NASA has ever flown. 4 people rode it: Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Cook, and Canadian astronaut Jeremy Hansen, the first non-American ever assigned to a lunar flight. Their job was not to land. This was a test flight, a 10-day loop around the moon on a free return path, designed to check every system a future landing crew would need without risking an actual touchdown. That is not a lesser mission, it is the necessary one. You do not send a brand new spacecraft past the moon for the first time with people inside and simply hope it works. You test it on a path that brings everyone home, even if something breaks along the way. It is worth pausing on why NASA waited 54 years to try this again. That patience was not fear. It was a hard lesson learned early in the space age. Every mission near Earth has a safety net. If something goes wrong on the space station, help can arrive within hours. Past the moon, that net disappears entirely. There is no rescue ship. There is no resupply flight. Once Orion committed to the far side of the moon, its crew became, for a stretch of hours, farther from any possible help than any human beings in history. Getting comfortable with that risk took years of ground testing, an entire uncrewed test flight in 2022, and, as it turns out, one unresolved problem with no backup plan at all. That problem is where this story gets uncomfortable, and we'll come back to it. First, the far side. 5 days into the flight, on April 6th, Orion made its closest pass to the moon, sweeping within roughly 4,000 miles of the surface. That pass made this crew only the second group of humans in history to see the moon's far side directly with their own eyes, following Apollo 8 back in 1968. People call it the dark side, but that name is misleading and it's worth clearing up. The far side gets just as much sunlight as the near side across a lunar day. What it never gets is a view of Earth, because the moon is tidally locked, always showing us the same face. That means the far side has been mapped by robotic probes for decades, but almost never actually witnessed by a living person until this flight. During this same pass, the crew crossed a distance record that had stood since Apollo 13 in 1970, when that crew reached roughly 248,000 miles from home. Artemis II pushed past that mark to about 252,000 miles out, confirmed by NASA in real time as it happened. Read that number again. The farthest any human being has ever traveled from Earth happened on this exact flight, on this exact day. And it was during this same window, purely because of where the spacecraft happened to be, that something else began to unfold that nobody had scheduled. As Orion swung around the far side, the moon itself slid directly between the spacecraft and the sun. For the crew, the sun didn't dim, it vanished. NASA's own mission updates described it in plain language. The capsule was passing behind the moon, and the sun was completely blocked from the astronauts' point of view. Rather than let the moment pass unused, the crew turned toward the sun's outer edge to study the solar corona, the faint glowing atmosphere that's normally impossible to see because the sun's glare overwhelms it. Here's the number that makes this land. The eclipse the crew experienced lasted 53 minutes. On the surface of Earth, the longest total solar eclipse that geometry allows is a little over 7 minutes, because the moon's shadow only lines up with any single point on a spinning planet for so long. Researchers who study eclipse mechanics point out that 53 minutes is nearly 7 times longer than the maximum any person standing on solid ground will ever witness. Sit with that for a second. 4 people, 250,000 miles from home, watched the sun disappear for most of an hour, and none of the engineers who built this mission had planned it as a highlight. It happened because of trajectory, not design, and the crew's cameras were not set up to record it as an event. That's the part almost nobody expected. The onboard systems were built to document engineering milestones, fuel burns, system checks, docking simulations. They were not built around the idea that the crew would need to capture nearly an hour of unplanned solar darkness on the far side of the moon. So when the cameras did catch it, mission specialists back on Earth were reportedly caught off guard by how much usable data came back from a moment nobody had scripted. Compare that to what an eclipse chaser on Earth goes through. Months of planning, travel to one narrow strip of land, and then, if the weather even cooperates, somewhere between 2 and 7 minutes before the sun reappears. NASA's own historical calculations put the absolute ceiling for any Earth-based eclipse at just over 7.5 minutes. The Artemis II crew blew past that ceiling by nearly a factor of 7, not because they found a better spot to stand, but because they were no longer standing on the planet doing the blocking. They were riding alongside the object causing the eclipse itself. While that darkness played out, the crew wasn't only running instruments in silence. Commander Wiseman pulled out his own personal phone and aimed it at the window as Earth slipped below the lunar horizon. An Earthset, the mirror image of the famous Earthrise photo from Apollo 8. He later said simply that he couldn't help himself. The footage was shot uncropped at roughly 8 times zoom, which he described as close to what a naked eye would actually see from that spot. In the background of that same clip, you can hear the mechanical click of Christina Cook's camera, its long lens firing off bracketed shots, calmly documenting the same Earthset through a completely different piece of equipment at the same instant. One astronaut following a checklist with professional gear, another unable to resist, catching the same moment on the kind of phone sitting in your own pocket right now. That contrast is the real story behind the "cameras caught something" headlines. It wasn't a malfunction. It wasn't an unexplained anomaly in the data. It was a deeply human impulse to grab a camera because something too beautiful to lose was happening outside a window on a spacecraft that was never supposed to be close enough to the moon for that impulse to even come up. Here's where this stops being just a nice picture story. The solar corona is genuinely hard to study, even with dedicated space telescopes, because blocking the sun's glare precisely enough to see the faint plasma around it is a real engineering challenge. A 53-minute natural blackout gave researchers a rare, uninterrupted window that ground-based instruments and even purpose-built coronagraph satellites almost never get in one continuous stretch. Scientists analysing the returned imagery have suggested this dataset could help refine models of how the corona behaves, models that matter for predicting solar storms that can disrupt power grids and satellites back on Earth. Every frame the crew captured during those 53 minutes, the eclipse footage, the corona imagery, the sweeping views of a far side almost nobody had seen since 1968, exists only because a much less glamorous engineering fight had already been won years earlier. And that fight had almost nothing to do with cameras, eclipses, or distance records. Rewind to December 2022. Artemis I, the uncrewed test flight that came before this one, splashed down safely in the Pacific after a 25-day loop around the moon. At the time, it was called a complete success. But when engineers pulled the capsule out of the water and inspected the heat shield closely, they found something nobody had predicted. Patches of the shield's protective material, a substance called avcoat, had cracked, and in places, chunks of it had broken away entirely, something engineers called char loss, in a pattern their ground testing had never produced. This was not a small cosmetic problem. Avcoat is the only thing standing between a returning crew and re-entry temperatures near 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit at speeds close to 25,000 miles per hour. It works by burning away in a controlled way, carrying heat off the capsule as it chars. Unlike almost every other system on Orion, there is no backup for it. It either performs exactly as designed, or there is no second chance once the capsule is already falling through the atmosphere. For nearly 2 years, NASA's investigation team worked to explain why. What they found was almost cruel in how simple it turned out to be. Orion's re-entry path uses a skip profile, dipping into the upper atmosphere, briefly climbing back out, then descending fully. During that dip, the heating rate dropped for a moment, and that drop let gas building up inside the avcoat material stop venting the way it should. Trapped with nowhere to go, pressure inside those small pockets kept rising. When the capsule re-entered a second time and heating resumed, that trapped gas forced its way out in small, sharp bursts, tearing chunks of material loose. NASA's fix wasn't a new heat shield. It was a new flight path, a modified skip trajectory engineered to let the material keep venting continuously instead of sealing itself shut mid-flight. It was tested first in ground-based heating chambers and reviewed by an independent team before anyone approved flying it with people aboard. Think about the choice NASA actually faced. Redesigning the shield from scratch, new material, new manufacturing, new testing, would likely have delayed the program by years on a schedule already running late. Flying the existing design unmodified risked repeating the same failure, this time with 4 people inside instead of empty seats. There was no option that removed the risk completely. Every path forward meant betting something, time, money, or lives, on an answer NASA believed in but could not fully prove until it actually mattered. Not everyone at NASA was convinced this was enough. Charles Camarda, a former astronaut and heat shield specialist who once flew a mission inspecting thermal protection systems after the Columbia disaster, reviewed the investigation and came away unpersuaded. His concern was direct and uncomfortable. He believed engineers still hadn't fully nailed down the root cause well enough to guarantee the new flight path would behave the same way every time, and he worried the fix could carry side effects nobody had modeled yet. NASA leadership disagreed and decided to fly Artemis II on schedule rather than delay for a full shield redesign, fully aware they were betting 4 lives on a trajectory fix rather than new hardware. This wasn't a minor technical disagreement. It was a real dispute between qualified engineers about whether the single most critical, zero backup component on the entire spacecraft was actually understood well enough to trust with a crew. On April 10, 2026, the answer arrived. After 10 days in space, Orion hit the atmosphere at roughly 25,000 miles per hour and endured a 6-minute communications blackout as superheated plasma surrounded the capsule and cut off radio contact. A tense silence every re-entry produces, regardless of what's happening underneath. Then, right on schedule, the parachutes opened and the capsule splashed down in the Pacific off the California coast in the late afternoon, landing under 3 miles from its target zone. Navy divers reached the capsule first, and once it was hoisted onto the recovery ship, closer inspection showed exactly what the modified flight path was supposed to produce. Some char loss was still visible, but it was noticeably reduced in size and amount compared to Artemis I, matching what the ground testing had predicted. Wiseman later described the shield's condition simply, saying it looked exactly as it should, with only a small amount of expected charring near the shoulder where the shield meets the capsule. NASA released its full post-flight heat shield report in the weeks after splashdown, confirming publicly that the char loss problem had been substantially reduced and that the results lined up closely enough with ground testing to validate the trajectory fix. The agency has said this outcome will not delay preparations for Artemis III, currently targeted for 2027, which will stay close to Earth rather than travel to the Moon, instead practicing rendezvous and docking with the lunar landers now in development. It's a deliberate, incremental step before anyone actually attempts a landing. Beyond the heat shield, NASA's broader inspection found the rest of Orion's systems, along with the ground infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center, held up well through this second launch cycle, with less wear than after Artemis I. The crew that flew Artemis II has spent the weeks since splashdown in medical checks, debriefings, and public appearances, describing a mission that performed close to flawlessly by every measure released so far. Artemis IV, if current planning holds, is scheduled for as early as 2028 and aims to land 2 astronauts near the lunar South Pole, the first time human boots would touch the Moon since December 1972. Here's the part that gets lost in the celebration. Camarda's original concern was never definitively disproven by one clean flight. Artemis II flew a free return path at re-entry speeds calibrated specifically for this mission profile. A future mission coming back from a longer lunar orbit or an actual landing trajectory will hit the atmosphere carrying more energy, under conditions the current fix hasn't been tested against yet. NASA's own engineers have been careful to frame Artemis II's results as validation for this mission, not proof that the underlying material science is fully solved for every scenario still ahead. It worked this time, under these conditions, and researchers now fully understand why, are two separate claims, and only one of them has actually been established. Zoom out from the eclipse timing and the heat shield numbers, and a pattern emerges that shows up whenever people push past the edge of what's routine. The moments everyone remembers, the accidental 53 minutes of darkness, the impulsive phone video of Earth setting behind an alien horizon, only happened because a far less glamorous, far more dangerous engineering problem got solved quietly first, by people who will never trend online for it. There's a small detail from the far side flyby that outlasts every technical figure in this story. Inside the Oriental Basin, a massive impact structure on the far side that this crew became the first humans to view up close, sit two small, previously unnamed craters. During the flight, the crew proposed names for them. One, they suggested calling Integrity. The other, they asked to be named Carol, after Reed Wiseman's late wife, who died of cancer in 2020. Two names, chosen in real time, 250,000 miles from the nearest cemetery, now written permanently into the geography of a world no human had ever walked on. Whatever else this mission proved about heat shields and eclipse geometry, it also proved something quieter, that even out past the edge of everything routine, grief and love still find a way to travel along. Artemis II's cameras were built to record engineering checklists, not an unplanned hour of darkness, not a widow's name carved into a crater, and not proof that a life-critical shield really is understood as well as NASA hopes. NASA got the pictures anyway. Whether that was enough, or whether the next crew will find out the hard way, is still an open question.